There are moments in history when the destiny of entire nations seems to rest on the shoulders of one ordinary person. Not a king surrounded by armies, not a conqueror marching across continents, not a wealthy ruler seated upon a magnificent throne. Sometimes God chooses someone the world has overlooked, someone rejected by the very people who should have loved him most. In the heart of ancient Egypt, the greatest civilization of its day stood on the edge of catastrophe. The mighty Nile still flowed through the land, as it always had. Farmers still walked their fields beneath the blazing sun. Merchants still opened their shops, and priests still entered the temples at dawn. From a distance, life appeared unchanged. Yet beneath that appearance, a silent disaster was unfolding. Harvests had failed. Food was disappearing. Fear was spreading from village to village. The famine that had once existed only in dreams had become a terrifying reality. Every road leading into Egypt grew crowded with weary travelers. Fathers carried hungry children. Mothers prayed that someone, somewhere, still had grain to sell. Families crossed deserts with little more than hope to sustain them. They all journeyed toward one destination, because rumors had spread far beyond Egypt's borders that there was still food in the land. Waiting at the center of this desperate crisis was a man whose wisdom had saved an empire. He wore fine linen reserved for the highest officials of Egypt. Around his neck hung a chain of gold, a symbol of royal authority. The king himself had entrusted this man with the responsibility of preparing an entire nation for the years of famine that no one else had seen coming. His decisions affected millions of lives. His commands reached every province of Egypt. To countless people, he appeared to be one of the most powerful men alive. But there was a secret that almost no one around him knew. Years earlier, this same man had worn the rough clothes of a slave instead of robes of honor. Before that, he had sat alone inside an Egyptian prison, forgotten by those who had promised to remember him. Before prison came false accusations. Before slavery came betrayal. And before betrayal came a family whose love had slowly been poisoned by jealousy. His name was Joseph. Many people know Joseph as the dreamer. Others remember him as the ruler who forgave his brothers. But between those familiar moments lies a remarkable journey through suffering, waiting, faith, and God's unseen providence. It is a story that reminds us that God's purposes often unfold in ways no human being could ever predict. The account of Joseph is found primarily in the book of Genesis, beginning in chapter 37, and continuing through the end of the book. It is more than the biography of one remarkable man. It explains how God preserved the family through whom his covenant promises would continue, setting the stage for events that would shape the history of Israel for generations to come. Long before Joseph stood in Pharaoh's palace, long before Egypt became his home, he lived among the rolling hills of Canaan. It was a land of shepherds, scattered settlements, rocky valleys, and seasonal pastures. Life depended on rainfall, healthy flocks, and strong family bonds. A household's survival was closely tied to its unity. Livestock represented wealth, wells represented life, and the reputation of a family could determine its future. Joseph was born into one of the most remarkable families recorded in Scripture. His father was Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, the man to whom God had promised descendants as numerous as the stars, and a land that would belong to them. Yet this family, chosen for God's covenant purposes, was far from perfect. Rivalries, deception, favoritism, grief, and broken relationships had already marked its history. The household into which Joseph was born carried both extraordinary promises and painful divisions. Joseph was the first son born to Rachel, the woman Jacob loved deeply, after years of labor and disappointment. His birth brought great joy to his aging father, Scripture tells us that Jacob loved Joseph more than his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age. That affection was genuine, but the way it was displayed would have consequences no one in the family fully understood at the time. In homes throughout the ancient world, parents were expected to show fairness among their children, especially in matters that affected inheritance and leadership. Open favoritism could stir resentment and threaten the stability of an entire household. What may have seemed like an expression of love gradually became the spark that ignited years of bitterness. Soon, Jacob would give Joseph a gift unlike anything his brothers possessed, a gift that would become one of the most recognizable symbols in all of Scripture. It was more than a beautiful garment. It was a visible declaration of honor, distinction, and special favor. To Joseph, it may have seemed like a father's loving gesture. To his brothers, it looked like something entirely different. It looked like a future being taken from them. And before long, another gift would enter Joseph's life, one that did not come from his father, but from God himself. It would be a dream so extraordinary that it would change the course of Joseph's life forever. The hills of Canaan were more than a place to live. They shaped every part of daily life. Shepherds rose before sunrise to lead their flocks toward fresh pasture, always watching the skies for rain and the horizon for danger. Sheep and goats represented a family's wealth, and protecting them required patience, endurance, and constant vigilance. In this world, every son had responsibilities. Every decision affected the survival of the household. Jacob's family was unlike any other. By this time, he had 12 sons through 4 women: Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah. These relationships reflected the customs and complexities of the ancient world, but they also brought deep tensions into the family. What began years earlier, with Jacob's love for Rachel and the rivalry between sisters, had left lasting wounds. Those divisions did not disappear with time. They quietly shaped the lives of the next generation. Joseph grew up surrounded by older brothers, who had spent years working in the fields, caring for livestock, and proving themselves through hard labor. Many of them were strong, experienced shepherds, who expected one day to carry their father's legacy. Yet Joseph occupied a different place within the family. As the first son born to Rachel, the wife Jacob loved most, he received affection that his brothers could not ignore. Genesis tells us that Jacob loved Joseph more than all his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age. Love itself was not the problem. The problem was that this preference became visible. One day, Jacob gave Joseph a special robe. Many English translations describe it as a coat of many colors, while others speak of an ornate or richly ornamented robe. The exact appearance of the garment is uncertain, and scholars have discussed its design for generations. What is clear from the biblical text is that it marked Joseph out as someone who held a place of special honor within the household. In the culture of the ancient Near East, clothing often communicated status. Kings wore distinctive garments. Priests had sacred clothing. Officials could be recognized by what they wore. A robe of distinction within a family could suggest authority, privilege, or a future leadership role. Whether Jacob intended that message or not, Joseph's brothers certainly believed they understood what it meant. Each time Joseph walked among them wearing that robe, it became a reminder of what they feared. They had spent years laboring under the scorching sun, yet their younger brother appeared to enjoy their father's highest favor. Resentment, once small enough to hide, began taking root in their hearts. Scripture says they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Notice how hatred rarely appears without warning. It often begins with comparisons, grows through unresolved bitterness, and eventually changes the way people see one another. The brothers no longer looked at Joseph simply as a member of their family. They began seeing him as a rival. Then something happened that none of them expected. God gave Joseph a dream. In the ancient world, dreams were widely regarded as significant. Across Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Canaan, rulers often sought interpretations of dreams, believing they could reveal divine messages or future events. The Bible, however, shows that not every dream comes from God. What made Joseph's dreams different was not merely that they were vivid, but that they were fulfilled exactly as God intended. Joseph's first dream was simple in its imagery, yet astonishing in its meaning. He and his brothers were binding sheaves of grain in a field. Suddenly, Joseph's sheaf stood upright, while the sheaves of his brothers gathered around it and bowed down. When Joseph told the dream to his brothers, they immediately understood its implication. "Do you intend to reign over us?" they asked. To them, it sounded outrageous. In their society, older brothers were expected to receive honor from younger ones, not the other way around. Joseph's dream seemed to overturn the natural order of the family. Their resentment deepened. Then came a second dream. This time the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed down before him. When Joseph shared this dream, even Jacob was troubled. He asked whether he, Joseph's mother, and his brothers were truly expected to bow before him, yet Genesis tells us something remarkable. Although Jacob rebuked Joseph, he also kept the matter in mind. Somewhere beneath his questions, he sensed these dreams might hold a meaning that had not yet been revealed. Joseph himself likely did not understand how or when these dreams would come to pass. He saw only fragments of a future that belonged to God. What neither he nor his family could imagine was that the path to those promises would lead through suffering before it led to fulfillment. God had shown Joseph the destination. He had not shown him the road. That road would soon begin on an ordinary day, when Jacob asked Joseph to perform what seemed like a simple family errand. It would become the last peaceful journey Joseph would ever make as a free man. Jacob waited until the morning light spread across the hills, before calling for Joseph. His older sons had taken the flocks north in search of better grazing land. Such journeys were common. Shepherds often traveled many miles when pasture became scarce, remaining away from home for days or even weeks. They had first settled near Shechem, a region whose name carried painful memories for Jacob's family. Years earlier, violence there had forced them to leave under difficult circumstances. Even now, Jacob could not be certain that everything was well. He turned to Joseph. "Go and see if it is well with your brothers, and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." It sounded like a simple request. Joseph did not argue. He did not question why he had been chosen. He simply obeyed. That quiet obedience would lead him farther from home than he could possibly imagine. The journey was not a short walk across a nearby field. Joseph crossed rugged hills and winding valleys beneath the relentless sun. Dust clung to his sandals as he searched for signs of the family flocks. When he finally reached Shechem, the pastures were empty. His brothers were nowhere to be found. At that moment, Joseph could have returned home and truthfully reported that he had not found them. Instead, he kept searching. Genesis records a small detail that is easy to overlook but carries great significance. A man found Joseph wandering in the fields and asked what he was seeking. "I am looking for my brothers," Joseph replied. The stranger had overheard them saying they intended to move on to Dothan. The brief encounter seems almost ordinary, yet it quietly reminds us of something profound. At several points throughout Joseph's life, seemingly ordinary events would become part of God's extraordinary plan. A chance meeting, a passing conversation, a forgotten prisoner, a troubling dream. None of these moments appeared remarkable on their own, yet together they formed a path that God would use to preserve many lives. Joseph thanked the man and continued toward Dothan. Dothan stood along important trade routes connecting Canaan with Egypt. Caravans carrying spices, perfumes, textiles, and other valuable goods frequently passed through the area. Merchants from distant lands traveled these roads, linking powerful kingdoms through commerce. Joseph had no reason to pay much attention to them. Soon enough, they would change his life forever. Long before Joseph reached the camp, his brothers noticed someone approaching across the open country. The distinctive robe made him easy to recognize. Against the pale landscape, the garment announced exactly who was coming. The sight stirred emotions that had been growing for years. Every remembered insult, every painful comparison, every dream they wished they had never heard, every reminder of their father's favoritism. Bitterness, left unchecked, had been quietly gathering strength. Now it demanded action. As Joseph drew closer, they began talking among themselves. "Here comes this dreamer." The words were not spoken with admiration. They were spoken with contempt. Then the conversation took an even darker turn. "Come now, let us kill him." It is one of the most chilling moments in Genesis. The brothers who had shared meals with Joseph, who had watched him grow from childhood, who belonged to the same family chosen by God, now discussed taking his life. Hatred had blinded them so completely that they no longer saw a brother. They saw only an obstacle. They imagined telling their father that a wild animal had devoured him. They believed Joseph's dreams would die with him. How often people imagine they can destroy God's purpose simply by removing the person through whom he intends to work. Yet throughout Scripture, human plans repeatedly collide with God's greater purposes. The brothers were making decisions for evil. God had not caused their hatred. God was not the author of their sin. They alone were responsible for the choices they were making. But even before those choices unfolded, God already knew how he would bring good from what they intended for harm. Before the plot could go any further, another voice interrupted the discussion. Reuben. As the oldest brother, Reuben carried a measure of responsibility within the family. Though his own failures had weakened his standing, his conscience would not allow him to participate in murder. "Let us not take his life," he urged them. Instead, he proposed that Joseph be thrown alive into a nearby cistern, intending to return later and rescue him in secret. His plan spared Joseph's life, for the moment. When Joseph finally reached his brothers, he came expecting conversation. Perhaps he smiled. Perhaps he greeted them warmly. Scripture does not tell us. It simply tells us what happened next. Without warning, they seized him. Hands that should have embraced him grabbed hold of him. Voices that should have welcomed him shouted in anger. Before Joseph fully understood what was happening, they stripped away the robe his father had given him. The beautiful garment, the symbol of favor that had fueled so much resentment, was torn from his shoulders. Then they dragged him toward a nearby cistern. These cisterns were large underground reservoirs, carved into rock to collect rainwater during the wet season. When empty, they became deep pits with steep, smooth walls that were almost impossible to climb without help. The brothers threw Joseph inside. Genesis notes with quiet simplicity that the pit was empty. There was no water, only darkness, only silence, only the painful realization that the people above him were his own brothers. Joseph called out. Years later, when those brothers spoke among themselves in Egypt, they would remember the distress of his soul, when he pleaded with us. The Bible never records Joseph's exact words, but it does reveal that he begged them for mercy. They did not listen. Then comes one of the most heartbreaking verses in the entire account. While Joseph remained trapped below, his brothers sat down to eat. The meal they shared was ordinary. The moment was not. As Joseph's cries echoed from the darkness beneath them, they carried on as though nothing had happened. Yet while they ate, something appeared on the horizon, a caravan. Its camels moved slowly across the landscape, carrying merchants on their way to Egypt. None of the brothers realized it. Neither did Joseph. But with every step those camels took, the next chapter of God's plan was drawing closer. As the merchants drew closer, the sound of camel bells echoed softly across the dry hills of Dothan. Their caravan moved with steady purpose, carrying valuable goods toward Egypt. The camels were heavily laden with aromatic gum, balm, and resin, commodities prized throughout the ancient world for medicine, perfume, and trade. These merchants traveled the well-worn routes, connecting Canaan with Egypt, where bustling markets and royal storehouses created endless demand for goods from distant lands. To the men in the caravan, this journey was simply another business expedition. To Joseph's brothers, it became an opportunity. It was Judah who spoke. His words would change history. "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." There was a painful irony in those final words. He is our brother. The statement was true. Yet instead of protecting their brother, they chose to profit from him. The others agreed. Joseph, still trapped inside the empty cistern, had no idea what was being decided above him. He had pleaded for mercy. He had hoped that someone, perhaps Reuben, perhaps Judah, perhaps one of the others, would remember the years they had lived together under their father's care. Instead, hands reached down into the darkness, not to rescue him, but to sell him. The young shepherd who had left home expecting to deliver a message from his father was now being handed over like merchandise. Genesis records that Joseph was sold for 20 pieces of silver. In that period of history, such a price reflected the market value of a young slave. The transaction was ordinary to the merchants. They likely saw nothing unusual about purchasing another servant for the long journey south. But heaven saw everything. God had not abandoned Joseph in the pit. God had not abandoned Joseph on the caravan, and God would not abandon him in Egypt. The brothers watched as the caravan slowly disappeared into the distance. With every step the camels took, Joseph moved farther from the only home he had ever known. The hills of Canaan faded behind him. Ahead lay hundreds of miles of unfamiliar land, foreign languages, unfamiliar customs, and an uncertain future. For the first time in his young life, Joseph was completely alone, or so it seemed. Scripture often reminds us that God's presence is not measured by comfortable circumstances. Some of his greatest works begin when his people feel most abandoned. Abraham left his homeland without knowing where he was going. Jacob fled from his brother with nothing but a staff. Years later, Moses would leave the palace and spend decades in the wilderness. Again and again, the Lord accomplished his purposes through journeys marked by uncertainty. Joseph's journey had only just begun. Meanwhile, back at Dothan, another problem remained. Jacob. Their father would expect Joseph to return. Questions would be asked. Explanations would be required. The brothers knew they could not simply say that Joseph had disappeared. They needed a story, one convincing enough to hide what they had done. So they took the robe. The very garment that had become the symbol of their jealousy would now become the centerpiece of their deception. They slaughtered a young goat and dipped the robe into its blood until the fabric was stained beyond recognition. Then they carried it home to Jacob, carefully avoiding any direct accusation. Instead, they presented the robe and asked their father to identify it. The deception echoed an earlier chapter in Jacob's own life. Many years before, Jacob had deceived his father Isaac by using the skin of a young goat. Now, years later, another goat became part of a deception that brought unimaginable sorrow into Jacob's own household. Scripture does not explicitly connect these two events, but together they illustrate a recurring truth. Deception leaves deep wounds that can echo through generations. When Jacob recognized the robe, his heart broke. Without seeing Joseph's body, without hearing eyewitness testimony, he concluded that a wild animal had surely torn his beloved son apart. His grief was overwhelming. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for many days. His sons and daughters tried to comfort him. But there are sorrows that words cannot quickly heal. Jacob refused to be comforted, saying he would go down to the grave mourning for his son. As the family mourned, only the brothers knew the truth. The robe had lied. Joseph was not dead. He was alive. Far to the south, the caravan continued its journey toward Egypt. Every mile carried Joseph farther from his father. Yet every mile also carried him closer to the purpose God had already seen, long before Joseph received his first dream. The road to God's promise was proving to be far more difficult than Joseph could ever have imagined. It was not a road lined with applause. It was a road marked by betrayal. And before Joseph would stand in a palace, he would first learn to serve faithfully in the house of another man. The caravan continued south for days. Each sunrise carried Joseph farther from the familiar hills of Canaan. The landscape gradually changed. Rocky pastures gave way to vast stretches of wilderness, where the wind swept across the sand without interruption. Water became precious. Every oasis was welcomed with gratitude, and every evening the merchants carefully arranged their camp before darkness settled over the desert. Joseph walked with chains around his wrists. The freedom he had known since childhood was gone. Only days earlier, he had been the favored son of a wealthy shepherd. He had slept beneath the stars, surrounded by family, believing the future lay somewhere among the hills of Canaan. Now he belonged to strangers. The dreams God had given him must have seemed impossibly distant. Yet the Lord had not forgotten his servant. The Bible does not describe Joseph's thoughts during the journey, and we should not pretend to know them. What Scripture does reveal throughout Joseph's life is that his faith would be tested again and again before the purpose of God became visible. Many believers have experienced the same mystery. God sometimes reveals his promises long before he reveals the path by which those promises will be fulfilled. After many days, the caravan finally reached Egypt. For someone raised in Canaan, the sight would have been astonishing. Egypt was unlike anything Joseph had ever known. While Canaan was a land of shepherds and scattered settlements, Egypt was one of the great powers of the ancient world. The mighty Nile River flowed through the country, bringing life to fertile fields that stretched along its banks. Skilled farmers harvested grain in abundance. Massive storehouses preserved food for future years. Cities bustled with craftsmen, traders, scribes, soldiers, and officials serving an organized government that had developed over many centuries. Towering temples rose above the surrounding buildings. Stone monuments reflected the wealth and ambition of the kingdom. Boats crowded the Nile, carrying grain, livestock, timber, and merchants from distant lands. Languages from across the ancient world could be heard in the marketplaces. Everything about Egypt communicated power, yet beneath its impressive appearance, it remained a nation like every other, a nation whose greatest achievements could never replace humanity's need for the one true God. Joseph entered this remarkable land not as a visitor, not as an honored guest, but as a slave. The slave markets were places where human lives were measured in prices rather than dignity. Buyers examined strength, age, health, and skills before negotiating with merchants. Families could be separated in a single moment. A person's future often depended upon whoever offered the highest payment. Joseph stood among those waiting to be purchased. No member of his family knew where he was. No friend could speak on his behalf. No earthly power could change his circumstances. But heaven knew exactly where he stood. Genesis records a simple fact that becomes one of the most important themes in Joseph's story. The Lord was with Joseph. Those words appear repeatedly throughout the account. They do not mean Joseph's life became easy. They do not mean suffering disappeared. They mean that God's presence remained constant, even when Joseph's circumstances changed dramatically. Soon an Egyptian official arrived to inspect the slaves. His name was Potiphar. Scripture identifies him as an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard, a position of considerable authority within the Egyptian government. He was a man accustomed to responsibility, discipline, and order. His household would have included servants, administrators, laborers, and soldiers. Managing such an estate required capable people, and Potiphar understood the value of recognizing ability. He purchased Joseph. In a matter of moments, Joseph's future changed again. The shepherd from Canaan became a servant in the house of one of Egypt's most influential officials. Humanly speaking, it appeared to be another tragedy. But from God's perspective, Joseph had been placed exactly where the next stage of his preparation would begin. Before Joseph could govern a nation, he would first learn to manage a household. Before he could oversee the wealth of Egypt, he would first prove faithful with responsibilities that seemed small. Before he could stand beside Pharaoh, he would learn humility through service. Scripture consistently reveals this pattern. God often prepares his servants in hidden places before calling them into public responsibility. Moses spent years tending sheep in Midian before leading Israel. David cared for his father's flock before becoming king. The apostles spent years learning from Christ before proclaiming the gospel to the nations. Preparation is rarely dramatic. It is usually quiet, daily, faithful. Joseph could not yet see where this season would lead. To everyone around him, he was simply another Hebrew slave beginning life in a foreign land. But heaven was writing a different story. Within the walls of Potiphar's house, Joseph would discover that faithfulness is never wasted in God's kingdom. The lessons he learned there would prepare him for responsibilities far greater than he could possibly imagine. Yet before long, another test would arise. It would not challenge Joseph's abilities. It would test his character. And character, far more than talent, would determine the course of his future. Every morning in Egypt began long before sunrise. Servants swept courtyards while the air was still cool. Bakers prepared fresh bread for the household. Water was drawn from wells and carried in clay jars. Livestock had to be fed, storerooms inspected, records updated, and countless daily responsibilities completed before the city fully awakened. Potiphar's estate functioned like a small community. Dozens of people worked together to keep the household running efficiently. Every servant had assigned duties. Every steward answered to someone above him. Order was essential because a man entrusted with Pharaoh's affairs could not allow disorder within his own home. Joseph entered that world as the newest servant. No one welcomed him as the favored son of Jacob. No one knew about the dreams he had received in Canaan. To the Egyptians around him, he was simply another Hebrew slave purchased at the market. Many people might have surrendered to bitterness under such circumstances. Joseph had every earthly reason to lose hope. His own brothers had betrayed him. His father believed he was dead. His homeland was hundreds of miles away. The future he once imagined seemed impossible. Yet the remarkable truth recorded in Genesis is not that Joseph complained, not that he demanded an explanation, not that he abandoned his faith. Instead, Scripture quietly repeats four words that become the heartbeat of his entire story. The Lord was with Joseph. Those words explain everything that follows. God's presence did not remove Joseph from hardship. It transformed the way he lived within it. Joseph worked faithfully. Whether the task involved carrying supplies, managing livestock, organizing storerooms, or serving members of Potiphar's household, he performed every responsibility with diligence. The Bible does not describe each assignment, but it makes something abundantly clear. Everything Joseph touched prospered. Day after day, Potiphar began noticing something unusual. This young Hebrew did not work merely when someone was watching. He could be trusted. He completed responsibilities carefully. He handled resources honestly. He respected authority. He demonstrated wisdom beyond his years. Trust is rarely built through one dramatic moment. It is built through countless ordinary moments. One faithful decision after another. One honest action after another. One responsibility handled with integrity after another. Eventually, Potiphar promoted Joseph. The responsibilities grew. Joseph began supervising other servants. Then he oversaw larger portions of the estate. Soon, Potiphar entrusted virtually everything he owned into Joseph's care. Genesis says that Potiphar left all he had in Joseph's charge and concerned himself with nothing except the food he ate. What extraordinary confidence! A foreign slave had become the chief administrator of one of Egypt's most important households. This promotion was not accidental. It was preparation. Years later, Joseph would oversee the resources of an entire nation. But before he managed Egypt's abundance, he learned to manage another man's household. Jesus would later teach a principle that echoes throughout Scripture. One who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much. Joseph lived that principle centuries before those words were spoken. God often entrusts greater responsibility to those who prove faithful with smaller assignments. The world frequently celebrates talent. God consistently values faithfulness. Joseph never knew that generations later, countless believers would draw encouragement from his example. He simply honored God where he had been placed. That is one of the quiet miracles in this story. Joseph did not wait for a palace before serving faithfully. He served faithfully in a place no one would have chosen. Sometimes people imagine that God's purpose begins when circumstances finally improve. Joseph's life teaches something different. God's purpose was already unfolding while Joseph was still wearing the clothes of a slave. Every responsibility, every lesson, every challenge was preparing him for something far greater. Yet prosperity often brings a different kind of test. Hardship reveals what people are willing to endure. Success reveals what they are willing to compromise. Genesis tells us that Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. His character had already attracted the attention of his master. Soon, his appearance would attract the attention of someone else. Someone whose influence carried the power to destroy everything Joseph had worked so faithfully to build. The next trial would not come from chains. it would come through temptation. And the choices Joseph made behind closed doors would reveal the true strength of his character. There are moments in every life when no crowd is watching, no family members are nearby, no friends are present to offer encouragement. No audience will ever applaud the decision that is made. Yet those quiet moments often reveal more about a person's character than the most public achievements ever could. Joseph had proven himself faithful in responsibility. Now he would be tested in integrity. Genesis tells us that Joseph was well built and handsome. This brief description is not given to celebrate his appearance. Instead, it prepares readers for the next challenge that would confront him. What had become noticeable to Potiphar because of Joseph's diligence also became noticeable to someone else for a very different reason. Potiphar's wife began to look upon Joseph with desire. The Bible records the event with remarkable restraint. It does not linger on unnecessary details. It simply reveals that she repeatedly sought to persuade Joseph to betray the trust that had been placed in him. This was not a single passing moment. It became an ongoing test. Day after day, the temptation returned. Joseph's response also remained the same. He refused. His refusal was not rooted merely in fear of being discovered. It was grounded in conviction. Joseph understood that Potiphar had entrusted him with extraordinary responsibility. Everything in the household had been placed under his care, except one thing, Potiphar's wife. To violate that trust would not simply be an offense against his master. It would be an offense against God. His words have echoed through the centuries. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Notice what Joseph did not say. He did not ask whether he could escape the consequences. He did not ask whether anyone would find out. He did not weigh the temporary pleasure against the possible risks. He viewed the situation through a different lens. He asked what was right before God. That perspective made all the difference. Throughout Scripture, genuine integrity begins with the recognition that God sees what others cannot. Long before human courts render judgment, the Lord knows every motive, every thought, and every hidden decision. Joseph understood this truth even while living far from his family and far from the land where he had grown up worshiping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The temptation continued. Genesis emphasizes that she spoke to Joseph day after day. Persistence often wears down human resolve. Repeated pressure can make wrong choices appear ordinary. Yet Joseph did not gradually lower his standards. He did not convince himself that one compromise would make no difference. Instead, he took another step. He refused even to remain in situations that would make compromise easier. There is wisdom in that decision. Sometimes the strongest act of courage is not standing closer to temptation, but choosing to walk farther away from it. Then came the decisive day. The household was unusually quiet. Many of the servants were absent from the house. Joseph entered to carry out his responsibilities, expecting another ordinary day of work. Instead, Potiphar's wife seized the opportunity. She caught hold of his garment and once again demanded that he remain with her. Joseph faced a decision that had to be made in an instant. He could stay and risk surrendering his integrity. Or he could flee, even if it meant leaving behind the garment she held in her hands. He chose to run. His outer garment remained behind. His integrity did not. Sometimes obedience to God requires leaving something valuable behind. Joseph lost a garment that day, but he preserved something far more precious, his character. Yet obedience does not always produce immediate reward. As Joseph hurried from the house, Potiphar's wife realized she had been rejected. Her desire quickly turned into anger. The garment that testified to Joseph's escape became the foundation of a false accusation. She called the servants together and claimed that Joseph had attacked her before fleeing. Later, when Potiphar returned home, she repeated the same accusation. The evidence appeared convincing. Joseph's garment was in her possession. Her story sounded believable. Joseph's voice is never recorded in this moment. Genesis does not tell us whether he defended himself or remained silent. It tells us only the outcome. Potiphar's anger burned. The trusted servant who had faithfully managed his household, the young man whose honesty had brought blessing wherever he served, was seized once again. For the second time in Joseph's life, he suffered because of the sinful choices of others. First, he had been betrayed by his brothers. Now he was condemned because of a lie. To human eyes, everything seemed to be moving in the wrong direction. The dreams appeared farther away than ever. From favored son to slave, from trusted steward to prisoner. But heaven had not changed its purpose. What looked like another devastating setback would become the next stage in God's preparation. Because beyond the prison walls, events were already unfolding that Joseph could not yet see. And once again, the Lord would prove that no prison is beyond his reach. The heavy prison doors closed behind Joseph with a sound that must have echoed through every hope he had carried from Canaan. For the second time in his life, everything had been taken from him. His brothers had stripped away his robe. Now Egypt had stripped away his freedom. The years of faithful service in Potiphar's house seemed to have vanished in a single afternoon. Every act of honesty, every responsibility carried with excellence, every decision to honor God appeared to have led only to deeper suffering. From a human perspective, it made no sense. If Joseph had stolen from his master, prison would have seemed understandable. If he had betrayed Potiphar's trust, punishment would have been expected. But Joseph had done the opposite. He had remained faithful. He had resisted temptation. He had chosen obedience over compromise. Yet he still found himself behind prison walls. This is one of the most challenging realities presented in Scripture. Faithfulness to God does not guarantee an easy path. Again and again, the Bible reminds us that obedience may lead through valleys before it reaches mountaintops. Noah obeyed and endured ridicule while building the ark. Moses obeyed and spent years in the wilderness. David was anointed king long before he sat upon the throne. The apostles faithfully proclaimed Christ and faced persecution for doing so. Joseph now joined that long line of servants whose circumstances seemed to contradict God's promises. Yet Genesis immediately reminds us of the truth that had followed Joseph from Canaan into Egypt. But the Lord was with Joseph. Those words change everything. God had not remained outside the prison. His presence entered with Joseph. The prison where Joseph was confined was not an ordinary place. Genesis describes it as the prison where Pharaoh's prisoners were kept. Men connected to the royal court were held there while awaiting judgment or punishment. The governor of such a prison would have needed trusted officials to maintain order, manage supplies, and oversee daily operations. Joseph arrived as another prisoner. He did not demand special treatment. He did not insist that life had treated him unfairly. He began serving faithfully once again. Perhaps the routine felt painfully familiar. Each morning brought responsibilities. Each day required diligence. Each evening ended behind locked doors. The scenery had changed. Joseph's character had not. People often imagine that greatness appears suddenly. Scripture paints a different picture. Greatness is usually formed through countless ordinary acts of faithfulness that no one celebrates at the time. The keeper of the prison soon noticed something different about Joseph. It was the same quality Potiphar had seen. Joseph could be trusted. He worked without constant supervision. He handled responsibilities with wisdom. He treated others fairly. He remained dependable. Trust, once again, began opening doors that human strength alone could never unlock. Before long, the keeper placed Joseph in charge of the other prisoners. The man responsible for the prison entrusted its daily administration to the Hebrew who had once arrived wearing chains. Genesis says that the keeper paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him, and whatever Joseph did, the Lord made it prosper. Notice how familiar those words sound. Potiphar had trusted Joseph completely. Now the keeper of the prison did the same. Different setting, different authority, the same faithful God. Joseph could not choose where he served, but he could choose how he served. That distinction remains just as important today. Many people spend years waiting for perfect circumstances before offering God their best. Joseph offered his best in slavery. He offered his best in prison. His faithfulness was not dependent upon comfort. It was rooted in confidence that God remained present, even when life seemed unfair. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The prison walls remained unchanged. No message arrived from Jacob. No brother came seeking forgiveness. No announcement declared Joseph's innocence. Silence filled the years. Yet silence does not mean God is absent. Often, the Lord accomplishes his deepest work in seasons when nothing appears to be happening. Character matures. Patience grows. Pride is refined into humility. Dependence upon God becomes stronger than dependence upon circumstances. Joseph was learning lessons inside that prison that no palace could have taught him. Then, without warning, 2 new prisoners arrived. They were not ordinary criminals. One had served Pharaoh as his chief cupbearer. The other had been Pharaoh's chief baker. Both had fallen from royal favor. Both were placed under Joseph's care. Neither man realized that their arrival was part of a plan God had been unfolding long before they crossed the prison threshold. The conversations that would follow inside those prison walls would eventually reach the ears of Pharaoh himself. And the dreams that had once brought Joseph into suffering were about to become the very instrument God would use to lift him toward the destiny he had promised years before. The prison had become a classroom. Now it was about to become the doorway to a palace. The prison settled into its familiar rhythm. Morning light filtered through narrow openings in the stone walls, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Guards changed shifts. Chains rattled in distant corridors. Meals were distributed with quiet efficiency. For most of the prisoners, each day looked much like the one before it, and hope slowly gave way to routine. Joseph continued serving faithfully. He had no way of knowing that the years of preparation God had ordained for him were nearing a decisive turning point. One morning, Joseph noticed something unusual. The 2 royal officials who had recently been placed under his care, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, looked deeply troubled. Their faces revealed the kind of concern that follows a sleepless night. They had each experienced a vivid dream, yet neither understood its meaning. In the ancient world, dreams were often regarded as significant. Egyptian rulers consulted advisors and wise men who claimed to interpret signs and visions. But Joseph did not place his confidence in human wisdom. Instead, he asked a question that revealed where his trust truly rested. Do not interpretations belong to God? Those simple words became a testimony to everyone who heard them. Joseph had been separated from his family. He had lost his freedom. He remained imprisoned for a crime he had not committed. Yet he still spoke confidently about the sovereignty of God. His circumstances had changed. His faith had not. The chief cupbearer spoke first. In his dream, a vine with 3 branches quickly budded, blossomed, and produced clusters of ripe grapes. Taking the grapes, he pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed it back into the king's hand. Joseph listened carefully. Then, by the wisdom God granted him, he explained the dream. The 3 branches represented 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh would restore the cupbearer to his former position. Once again he would stand before the king and serve him as he had done before. It was a message of hope. Then Joseph made a humble request. When all goes well with you, remember me, show kindness to me. Mention me to Pharaoh, and help me get out of this prison. Joseph did not claim innocence with bitterness. He simply stated the truth. He had been taken from the land of the Hebrews. He had done nothing deserving imprisonment. It was a heartfelt appeal from a man who had every reason to believe that perhaps, at last, the door to freedom was beginning to open. The chief baker, encouraged by the favorable interpretation, stepped forward. His dream was different. He carried 3 baskets of baked goods upon his head, prepared for Pharaoh. Yet birds descended and ate the bread from the upper basket before it could reach the king. Joseph listened with the same care. This interpretation, however, carried no joyful news. The 3 baskets also represented 3 days. But within those 3 days, Pharaoh would execute the chief baker, and birds would feed upon his body. It was a difficult message to deliver. Joseph did not soften the truth to make it more acceptable. Nor did he speak harshly. He simply declared what God had revealed. 3 days later, Pharaoh celebrated his birthday. The royal court gathered. Servants hurried through the palace. Officials assembled before the throne. On that very day, exactly as Joseph had said, the chief cupbearer was restored to his office, and the chief baker was executed. The dreams had been fulfilled with remarkable precision. For Joseph, it must have seemed as though the next chapter of his own life was finally about to begin. Surely the cupbearer would remember. Surely he would tell Pharaoh about the young Hebrew who had interpreted his dream. Surely justice would finally prevail. But Scripture records one of the saddest sentences in Joseph's story. The chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. The man whose future had been restored walked back into Pharaoh's palace. Joseph remained behind prison walls. Days passed, then weeks, then months. No messenger arrived. No pardon was issued. No explanation was offered. The silence returned. For many people, forgotten seasons become seasons of discouragement. Questions arise. Why has God delayed? Have his promises failed? Has he forgotten? Joseph's experience reminds us that God's timing is rarely the same as ours. Had Joseph been released that day, he might simply have returned to Canaan. But God intended something far greater than Joseph could yet imagine. The prison was not the end of Joseph's story. Neither was the delay. What appeared to be another disappointment was, in reality, another act of divine preparation. The same God who had given Joseph dreams in Canaan, the same God who had been with him in Potiphar's house, the same God who had remained present inside the prison, was still directing every moment, even when nothing seemed to be happening. 2 full years would pass. Then, in a single night, God would speak again, not to Joseph, but to the most powerful ruler in Egypt. And the dreams that once brought Joseph into suffering would become the very means by which God lifted him from the prison to the palace. 2 years passed. 2 years of unanswered questions. 2 years of faithful service inside prison walls. 2 years in which nothing appeared to change. The seasons came and went beyond the prison gates. The Nile rose and fell according to its yearly cycle. Crops were planted and harvested. Pharaoh continued to rule over the greatest empire of his age. Life in Egypt moved forward, while Joseph remained in the same place. From a human perspective, it seemed as though his story had been forgotten, but heaven had not forgotten. The God who governs history is never hurried, and he is never late. While Joseph waited in prison, events were quietly moving toward a moment that no human being could have arranged. Then, one night, Pharaoh dreamed. The dream was unlike any he had experienced before. He stood beside the Nile, the great river that sustained the life of Egypt. Year after year, its waters nourished the fields and made the nation prosperous. To the Egyptians, the Nile represented security and abundance. Everything depended upon its faithful rhythm. As Pharaoh watched, 7 healthy cows emerged from the river. They were strong, well-fed, and grazed peacefully among the reeds. Then 7 more cows came up from the Nile. These were painfully thin. Their ribs showed through their skin. Their appearance was so alarming that they seemed entirely out of place beside the healthy animals. Without warning, the thin cows devoured the healthy ones. Yet after consuming them, they remained just as gaunt as before. The dream ended. Pharaoh awoke. Perhaps he dismissed it as nothing more than a strange vision of the night. But sleep returned, and with it came another dream. This time he saw 7 full, healthy heads of grain growing from a single stalk. They were rich and heavy with promise. Then 7 thin heads of grain appeared, scorched by the hot east wind that swept across the desert. The withered grain swallowed the healthy grain. Again, the dream ended. This time Pharaoh remained awake. The images would not leave his mind. Something about these dreams disturbed him deeply. Scripture does not tell us exactly why he felt such urgency, but it makes one thing clear. He knew these dreams carried meaning. As morning dawned, Pharaoh summoned the wisest men in Egypt, magicians, scholars, advisors, men whose reputations had been built upon knowledge, learning, and interpretation. One after another they listened as Pharaoh described the dreams. The healthy cows, the starving cows, the full ears of grain, the scorched ears. Silence filled the room. No one could provide an answer. No explanation satisfied the king. The greatest minds in Egypt stood helpless before a mystery that only God could reveal. Throughout Scripture, there are moments when human wisdom reaches its limit. No amount of education, influence, or experience can uncover what belongs to the Lord alone. This was one of those moments. As Pharaoh searched the faces of his advisors, frustration spread throughout the royal court. The palace that normally echoed with confidence now stood in uncertainty. Then, suddenly, someone remembered. Standing among Pharaoh's officials was the chief cupbearer. 2 years earlier, he had walked out of prison with his position restored exactly as Joseph had foretold. For 2 years he had said nothing. For 2 years, Joseph's name had never crossed his lips. Now, confronted by Pharaoh's impossible dreams, memory returned with startling clarity. The cupbearer stepped forward. "I remember my faults this day." He began recounting the events that had taken place inside the prison. He spoke of the Hebrew young man who had served under the captain of the guard. He described how both he and the chief baker had dreamed on the same night. He explained how Joseph had interpreted each dream. Most importantly, he testified that everything had happened exactly as Joseph had said. The room grew quiet once again. This time, however, the silence carried expectation. Somewhere inside an Egyptian prison, sat a forgotten Hebrew slave, a man whom no one had thought about for 2 years, a man whose God had revealed the meaning of dreams when Egypt's greatest advisors could not. In a single moment, the forgotten prisoner became the most important person Pharaoh needed to see. Messengers were sent immediately. Their footsteps echoed through the streets of Egypt as they hurried toward the prison. Joseph had awakened that morning, expecting another ordinary day behind stone walls. He had no reason to believe anything would be different. He could not see the royal messengers approaching. He did not know that Pharaoh himself was asking for him. He did not realize that before the sun set, he would stand in the presence of the most powerful ruler in Egypt. Sometimes God's answers arrive after long seasons of silence. Not gradually, not with small hints, but suddenly. Years of waiting can give way to one moment that changes everything. As the prison doors opened and the guards called Joseph's name, the next chapter of God's purpose began to unfold. The road from the pit had led to slavery. The road from slavery had led to prison. Now, for the first time, the road was leading toward the palace.